This panel went way beyond a normal political debate, and the arguments made here get right to the heart of how power is actually maintained in American politics. Before we break it all down, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you think about this discussion. Leigh McGowan went on CNN Newsnight with Abby Phillip and absolutely dismantled the Republican defense of gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the broader strategy Republicans continue using to stay in power, despite increasingly unpopular policies. What made this panel so intense is that the discussion stopped pretending this was just normal political disagreement and instead focused on the core issue, whether Republicans can actually win fairly without manipulating the system itself. Throughout the exchange, Leigh McGowan and Tennessee Congressman Justin Pearson pointed directly at what's happening across multiple Republican-controlled states: heavily gerrymandered maps, attacks on mail-in voting, restrictions on drop boxes, closing polling stations, and redistricting efforts specifically designed to dilute Democratic voting power. And when some conservatives on the panel tried framing it as both sides do it, Leigh McGowan and Teslin Figueroa pushed back hard, arguing that Democrats can no longer afford to keep playing by old political norms, while Republicans aggressively weaponize power at every level of government. But the most important moment came when Leigh McGowan explained where all of this ultimately leads. She argued that the solution is not just complaining about Republican tactics, it's putting Democrats back in power so they can pass legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, ban partisan gerrymandering, expand voting access, reduce dark money influence, and protect Democratic participation itself. And honestly, this entire clip exposed a much bigger conversation happening right now in American politics: whether democracy can actually function properly when one side increasingly relies on restricting participation instead of expanding its appeal to voters.
It ends where we make dark money out of politics. It ends when you put Democrats who already voted for the John Lewis Voter Rights Act back in power, and you actually pass those things that make voter election day a holiday, that give us mail-in ballots, that give us safety in voting, all the things the Republicans are currently trying to rip away.
Back to our discussion on redistricting wars, Congressman, you were saying.
I just wanted to make the basic point that in the presidential election, Trump got 65%, Kamala Harris got 35%. So it's easy to assume that Tennessee is 35% Democratic. Of the current 9 seats, 1 seat is Democratic. Of 35%, it would be 3 seats would be Democratic. Right now it's 1. Under this new redistricting, it'll be 9 Republican, 0 Democratic. That's just not right. And this is happening all over our country, and it's destroying our country.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans were just complaining about this very thing in Virginia a couple weeks ago. And so now this is an even more extreme example of how, putting aside race for a second, just if you're a Democrat in the state, you have no shot of having a representative that has your interests in mind in Washington at this point.
Which is similar to many places in the Northeast. And I will say, I think the Tennessee move is in direct retaliation. And I'll say retaliation because Hakeem Jeffrey said it was maximum warfare. That's what he said after the Virginia redistricting.
He was responding to Trump redistricting Texas.
Right. He didn't say that.
Why don't we just all agree? Why don't we all agree? We're all different viewpoints. Why don't we all agree this is wrong? Gerrymandering is wrong. Safe seats is hurting our country because people do not listen to the people when they're in safe seats. They just pander to their base, and that's killing our country. Let's all agree. Conservative, liberal, moderate, all of us, whatever you guys are. Let's all agree this is wrong.
Agree. It's wrong.
And let's also agree that they won't be changing it. And let's also agree it's time for tit for tat. I know you say you don't want tit for tat. I'll support tit for tat.
What's the problem? We're not going to resolve anything.
Oh, no, it's okay. But you guys want to go there, so let's go there. Let's tit for tat. And with Representative Pearson, the energy that he brought today, and I put it out on my social media, everybody was loving it. They're not going to change it. So crying about it's not going to make a difference. California's going to make up the difference. Virginia's going to make up the difference. Organizing voters. Democrats need to flip the House and need to expand the Supreme Court because that's what this is about.
But where does this end?
It ends at the For the People's Act, what the Democrats tried to pass and all voted for, that banned partisan gerrymandering. It ends where we make dark money out of politics. It ends when you put Democrats who already voted for the John Lewis Voter Rights Act back in power, and you actually pass those things that make voter election day a holiday, that give us mail-in ballots, that give us safety in voting, all the things the Republicans are currently trying to rip away. Voter suppression started with gerrymandering, and then closing polling stations, and then limiting drop boxes, and then mail-in voting, and early voting, and same-day registration. Those are all taking away from certain communities that vote Democratic. We have to stop doing that. And it ends when you put Democrats in charge and you actually pass the laws that they tried to pass before and all voted for, and Republicans voted against.
It ends with Democrats in charge. That's
yes,
the goal.
Okay,
that is the goal. That's why the gerrymandering
protections and
listen.
But this is why the gerrymander keeps happening.
But Lydia,
Republicans are doing it in response to that.
Should Republicans and put their weapons down and say, hey,
they actually
let's
did.
stop.
They actually did. In Indiana, they tried to do just
Wait
that.
a second.
They said, you know what? We're going to
That is not a good
Indiana,
example.
they said, we're not going to gerrymander.
Hold on, Lydia. That is not what happened, okay? Republicans did not say we're going to stop doing this. So some Republicans voted against it, and then they were targeted by the president this week. And 5 out of 7 of them voted out of their seats. And while that was happening down in Florida, a Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, said that he was going to redistrict his state to eliminate Democratic representation.
That was a moment.
There is no ceasefire happening on the part of Republicans.
That was a ceasefire. And in response to the ceasefire in Indiana, Virginia said, hold my beer, let me get rid of all of the red
Lydia,
votes.
it wasn't a ceasefire. It was more like a mutiny. Yeah. And President Trump hated the fact that they pushed back on him. And you know why he hated it so much? He hated it because
so that doesn't
it's
count
not
Indiana. That just doesn't. No one cares. No one cares that they opted not to gerrymander.
That's not the same thing as Republicans saying we're not going to gerrymander anymore. Because at the same time that was happening, they were planning to gerrymander in Florida.
But you know what? You know what? All of those Republicans who were upset were right because Indiana said we're going to stop it, and then
and guess what? We don't want
decided to gerrymander. So they were
then Republicans spent $6 million voting them out of their seats.
And Democrats better start spending $12 million. So no ceasefire.
We got to leave it there. Thank you.
What made this discussion so important is that it finally cut through one of the biggest dishonest talking points that always gets used whenever conversations about voter suppression or gerrymandering come up. The idea that this is simply both sides playing politics equally. Because once you actually examine what is happening structurally across the country, it becomes very obvious that this is not just ordinary political competition anymore. What we are seeing is one political party increasingly relying on manipulating the rules of democracy itself because its actual policy agenda is becoming less and less popular with the broader public. And Leigh McGowan was absolutely correct to frame the conversation that way. Because think about what Republicans are actually defending here. They are defending maps where states with large Democratic populations somehow end up with overwhelmingly Republican congressional delegations. They are defending systems where millions of votes effectively become politically meaningless because district lines are engineered in advance to guarantee outcomes before voters even cast ballots. They are defending reducing polling locations, limiting drop boxes, restricting mail-in voting, opposing election day holidays, fighting same-day registration, and continuously making voting more difficult in heavily Democratic areas. And then somehow we are all supposed to pretend this is just normal Democratic behavior? It isn't. Justin Pearson's point about Tennessee perfectly exposed the absurdity of this system. Donald Trump received roughly 65% of the vote in Tennessee, meaning Democrats still represent roughly a third of the electorate there. In a genuinely representative system, that would logically translate into multiple Democratic seats. Instead, Republicans engineered maps that effectively erase Democratic representation almost entirely. And this is not isolated. It is happening across the country. That's why the both sides argument starts collapsing the second you seriously examine the scale of what's happening. Now, yes, Democrats absolutely engage in political maneuvering too. No serious person denies that. But there is a difference between participating in politics and systematically reshaping democratic systems to insulate yourself from voters. Republicans increasingly operate from the understanding that expanding voter participation is dangerous to their long-term political survival. That is the key issue here. And honestly, Leigh McGowan said something extremely important that people need to pay attention to. Republicans fight this hard against voting expansion because they know broader participation hurts them politically. That is the uncomfortable reality underneath all of this. If Republicans truly believe their agenda overwhelmingly benefited ordinary Americans, they would want the highest voter turnout possible. They would want easier voting access. They would want more participation. They would welcome expanded democracy because they would trust voters to reward them politically. Instead, what do we consistently see? Resistance to mail-in voting. Resistance to early voting, resistance to same-day registration, resistance to expanded ballot access, resistance to making Election Day a holiday, resistance to restoring Voting Rights Act protections, resistance to independent redistricting, resistance to anti-gerrymandering reforms, resistance to campaign finance reform. Why? Because high participation environments tend to benefit Democrats and progressive policies more broadly. That is not even speculation anymore. We have years of electoral data showing this trend. The more representative and participatory the system becomes, the harder Republicans struggle nationally unless they significantly moderate their positions. And this is where the broader hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. Republicans constantly frame themselves as defenders of democracy, freedom, liberty, and the voice of the people. But if you genuinely believed in democratic participation, you would not spend this much time trying to narrow access to voting or dilute the political influence of groups that disagree with you. That contradiction is exactly what this panel exposed. And honestly, Tesla and Figaro's point about Democrats abandoning the when they go low, we go high mindset reflects a growing frustration inside Democratic and progressive circles. For years, many Democrats believed that preserving institutional norms, maintaining decorum, and respecting traditional political boundaries would ultimately stabilize the system. But what they increasingly discovered is that Republicans were willing to aggressively exploit those norms whenever it benefited them politically. That creates an asymmetrical political environment. One side continues trying to preserve norms. The other side increasingly views norms as obstacles to power. And eventually frustration builds because people begin feeling like unilateral restraint is politically suicidal. Now, to be very clear, there is a difference between fighting back politically and abandoning democratic principles entirely. That distinction matters. But what many Democrats are now arguing is that they can no longer afford to respond passively while Republicans aggressively reshape the electoral landscape state by state. And honestly, history explains why people feel this urgency. The Supreme Court's weakening of the Voting Rights Act opened the floodgates for many of these state-level restrictions. Dark money exploded after Citizens United. Partisan gerrymandering intensified. State legislatures became increasingly insulated from public opinion. And the result is a political environment where many voters genuinely feel like electoral outcomes are being structurally manipulated before campaigns even begin.
That feeling is deeply dangerous for democracy, because once people stop believing their votes meaningfully matter, political cynicism explodes, trust in institutions collapses, participation declines, extremism grows. And ironically, that disengagement often benefits the very people undermining participation in the first place. That's why Leigh McGowan's emphasis on structural reforms mattered so much. She wasn't just saying Democrats need to win elections. She was arguing that democracy itself requires reforms protecting broad participation and fair representation. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, anti-gerrymandering legislation, campaign finance reform, expanded mail-in voting, election day holidays, voting protections, independent districting. These are structural democratic reforms. And notice something important? Republicans fight nearly all of them. That tells you everything. Because if your political survival depends on restricting participation, manipulating districts, and benefiting from dark money influence, then eventually people start asking a very uncomfortable question. Can your movement actually sustain majority support democratically without those advantages? That is the question Republicans increasingly do not want asked.
And honestly, the Indiana example on the panel was revealing too, because it showed how internal Republican incentives now work. Even Republicans who resist aggressive gerrymandering often face immediate political punishment from within their own party. That's how deeply entrenched this strategy has become. The pressure is not toward democratic fairness. The pressure is toward maximizing partisan advantage at all costs. That is a dangerous place for any democracy to end up. Because once both sides fully embrace permanent escalation with no shared democratic standards, the legitimacy of the system itself starts eroding. Now, some conservatives on the panel tried arguing that Democrats are simply angry because Republicans are better at politics, but that argument completely ignores the underlying issue. The concern is not merely that Republicans are politically effective. The concern is that they are increasingly normalizing minority rule mechanisms that allow them to hold disproportionate power even when their broader agenda is unpopular nationally. And Chris on Culture touched on something extremely important at the end of the clip. Many individual progressive policies are actually widely popular across party lines. Protecting Social Security, protecting Medicare, higher taxes on the ultra-rich, reducing corporate influence, expanding healthcare access, protecting voting rights, opposing endless wars, raising wages. Many of these positions consistently poll well, which again raises the question, if Republicans are confident in their policy agenda, why rely so heavily on restricting participation instead of broadening appeal? That's the heart of the issue. And the reality is this conversation goes beyond Democrats versus Republicans. It goes to the future of democratic legitimacy itself, because a functioning democracy cannot sustainably operate if one side increasingly believes the solution to political weakness is limiting participation rather than persuading more voters. At some point, democracy stops functioning properly when politicians choose voters instead of voters choosing politicians. That is exactly why these fights over voting rights, district maps, polling access, and representation matter so much. They are not side issues. They are the foundation underneath everything else.